received these questions from all of our social media sites, so we're going to answer a few of these for everybody. All right, first up, who built the penitentiary walls and buildings? Well, actually the inmates helped in the construction of most, if not all of the buildings on site here. Now, while contract workers would have been brought in, engineers, architects, things like that, it was actually the inmates that helped build the site. So great first question there. Okay, who was the most famous individual housed at the Idaho State Penitentiary? Well, of course, this is a loaded question because how do you answer who's the most famous? We all have some that we like. Of course, Harry Orchard, who assassinated former governor, is probably the most notorious one. Again, because he had assassinated a former governor, that really lent itself for him being kind of the most famous. And he was the longest-serving inmate. He was baptized in the plunge bath here in the dining hall, so all sorts of interesting things about him. Another semi-famous one probably would be Bob Meeks, who was an associate of Butch Cassidy. He also escaped from here several times. And then finally, last but not least, Lyda Southard, who is possibly one of Idaho's first female serial killers, of course the first one that we know about. So another great question there. All right, what was the most times an individual has returned and did time at the old pen? Again, I'm going to make this two parts. So for the women, it was Barbara Singleton, and she came here 4 times on forgery or bad checks. So Barbara Singleton for the ladies. For the men, we're fairly certain the one that we found was here 5 times. This is not counting parole violations, by the way, because there were several men who came and went several times because of parole violations. But different crimes. William Dreyer was in for forgery out of Bannock and Bonneville counties, and again 5 times there. We know of at least a couple other guys that were in 4 times. I know Nathaniel Kidd being in 4 times, and those were various crimes that he committed. So another great question, and we do know we're going to have a podcast about William Dreyer, so stay tuned for that, the Behind the Gray Walls podcast. Okay, next one. Were women given the same treatment as men at the Idaho State Penitentiary? This is another loaded question. The answer is yes and no. Of course, they were isolated from families. Being in prison is your sentence. However, women were given far fewer options as far as jobs and things to occupy their time. And some people may say, well, that's great. They just got to sit around and do nothing. Well, when you're in prison, one of the worst things is the time suck, not being able to do anything and be industrious with your time. So in that respect, I think the women had it not as well. That being said, they did not have solitary confinement. They didn't have many of those things that punish them further within prison, and they weren't held at the same standard as far as sentencing sometimes. So women wouldn't be in it for as long as, say, murder or things like that. So it's a loaded question. The answer is yes and no. So, okay. All right, this is more specific to what we do now. How do you decide what events to hold at the penitentiary? Well, the easy answer is to say we're just really creative and have really great ideas, but really we look to the public. We look to you guys to tell us what to do. And so we really look for feedback on the events that we do. Suggestions on sleepovers or things like that led to Sleepless in Stripes. So really we're looking to you to make those decisions, and then we just put our creative energy behind it to connect the history so that everything we do is really connected back to the history of the site. So great question. All right. Okay. Any spooky stories? Again, always a loaded question. For me personally, it wasn't really until this past year when we started researching the women, again, of the Idaho State Penitentiary. And I was walking into the women's ward, and I just became overwhelmed with the smell of cigarette smoke. Well, I was opening the building for the first time, so no one else had been in there. There was nothing in the garbage cans, and I just kind of got the sense that these women were sort of just sitting there, kind of smoking their cigarettes, wondering what I was doing. And then beyond that, again, within the same past year, I was up in my office and I thought one of my coworkers was playing a little bit of a trick on me. I see this shadow come across, and I think I said something like, I see you, Anthony, and the shadow went away, and no one was there. Anthony, comes bebopping up the stairs about 15 minutes later, and that's when I realized it wasn't him, and it wasn't anyone else that was in the building. So those are just a few of my personal ones. There's of course many more spooky stories, so we'll continue with that one as we go along. So.